Have you ever considered the invisible rules that basically govern what survives in our society and what disappears?
Oh, that's a big question to start with.
Yeah, well, I want you to really sit with that for a moment because, we are completely conditioned to believe that in a democracy, popularity is like the ultimate shield.
Right, exactly. The whole idea that if people love it, it stays.
Exactly. The implicit contract we all kind of believe in is that if a public program works, if it visibly, tangibly improves the country, and if the public absolutely adores it, it just becomes permanent.
You'd think so, yeah.
The people love it, so it
Well,
stays. But what happens when you discover that popularity, even, overwhelming, undeniable, multi-partisan popularity, is actually a terrible armor against destruction?
yeah, it really forces you to rethink how institutions are actually maintained in the real world.
It totally does.
Because we operate under this assumption that a beloved public work is like a fortress,
Hmm.
right? Protected by public opinion. But history shows us that when a beloved institution dies, it almost never dies in this massive public siege.
Right, it's not some huge dramatic event.
Exactly. It dies in the quietest, most procedural ways imaginable.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the death of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, in 1942.
It's such a fascinating case study.
It really is. We're
Yeah.
going to examine a pretty incredible stack of historical sources, legislative records, primary documents, just to understand a profoundly strange historical riddle.
Which is basically, how does the most popular thing the government ever built simply vanish?
Right. And I need to set the mission for this deep dive right up front for everyone listening. This isn't a story of a program failing because people hated it or, because it didn't work.
Not at all.
It's actually a tragedy about the absolute limits of public popularity. Our goal today is to look at the quiet, almost invisible legal mechanism that killed the CCC.
And what its death teaches us about how institutions actually survive.
Exactly. But before we jump into the timeline, I know you wanted to set some ground rules for how we look at this.
Yeah, I think we really need to deliberately resist sentimentality today.
Which is hard with the CCC.
It is incredibly hard because when we look back at the CCC, it is so easy to get swept up in the romance of it all.
Oh, sure, the archival footage, right?
Yeah, exactly. You see these old films of healthy young men planting trees, building our state parks, reviving the American landscape during, the darkest days of the Great Depression.
Yeah, it evokes a very powerful nostalgia.
It really does. But the true fascination here and the real lesson for anyone studying how government actually functions lies entirely in the procedural nuance.
The boring bureaucratic stuff.
Basically, yeah. Because the CCC wasn't dramatically abolished in some fiery congressional showdown.
Right.
No one took a sledgehammer to it on the House floor. It was simply, it was starved of funds.
Huh.
It was an administrative execution, not a public one.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I'm stuck on this idea of an administrative execution. How do you quietly kill something that popular?
It takes very specific circumstances.
I mean, everyone from local mayors to everyday families loved this program. To understand how it died, do we have to look at how it operated?
Actually, we have to look at the moment it tried to become immortal.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, the deepest irony of the 1942 collapse is that the very people who built the CCC, and specifically Franklin D. Roosevelt, they saw this exact vulnerability coming years in advance.
Wait, really? Roosevelt knew it was going to die.
Well, he understood the incredibly fragile nature of the legal foundation he had built. He knew the CCC was born out of a specific emergency, the Great Depression.
Right, it was an emergency relief program.
Exactly. But as he watched the program, transform the landscape and the young men in it, he recognized that its value extended far beyond just temporary economic relief.
He saw the bigger picture.
He did. He saw a permanent, ongoing role for a federal conservation workforce.
Wait, so Roosevelt knew it was vulnerable. Did he just, quietly hope it would survive? Or did he actively try to change his legal status?
Oh, he made a highly calculated, formal move. Our sources point directly to a very specific date.
Okay, what day?
April 5th, 1937.
1937, okay.
The timing of this is incredibly significant. He sent this message to Congress exactly 4 years to the day after he created the Corps by executive order in 1933.
So it was an anniversary push.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it wasn't a passing suggestion in a broader speech. It was a standalone formal request titled Message to Congress on Making the Civilian Conservation Corps a Permanent Agency.
Wow. So he's practically planting a flag saying this is no longer an experiment, this is a permanent fixture of the American government.
That was exactly his intent.
What did that blueprint actually look like, though? Was it just, a continuation of what they were already doing?
He provided a very detailed, structured blueprint that would have woven the CCC into the permanent fabric of the federal government.
What were the specifics?
Well, he asked Congress for a standing corps of 300,000 youths and war veterans.
300,000. That's a massive standing workforce.
It is. And he also specifically outlined the inclusion of 10,000 Native Americans and 5,000 enrollees in U.S. territories.
Okay, so he's really codifying it.
Yes, he was formalizing its demographic structure, defining its exact scale, and cementing its mission. He argued to Congress that there was, and I quote here from the sources, ample useful work in the protection, restoration, and development of our national resources for an extended future period.
So his argument is essentially like the soil isn't going to stop eroding just because the economy gets better.
Right.
The forests are still going to need management. The public lands will always need stewardship.
Exactly.
So the work is permanent, therefore the agency should be permanent. I mean, that seems like a slam dunk argument for a popular program.
You would think so. But Congress completely rebuffed him.
They just said no.
They rejected the idea of permanence outright. Instead of a permanent charter, Congress granted only a temporary extension in 1937.
Just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. And they didn't just extend it, they actually altered its operational mandate.
Oh, what do they do?
They added a new requirement mandating 10 hours per week of general and vocational education for the enrollees.
I want to pause on that for a second because adding a 10-hour education requirement sounds nice on paper, but logistically...
It's a nightmare.
Right. If you're running a massive work camp, suddenly carving out 10 hours a week for every single man to be in a classroom, that completely changes the nature of the program, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It slows down the actual conservation work.
Yeah.
It drastically shifts the operational focus. It forced camp commanders to redirect resources, build classrooms, hire instructors, and pull men off the work lines.
Which means fewer trees planted, fewer trails built.
Right. But more importantly, from a legislative standpoint, it signaled that Congress viewed the CCC not as a permanent federal conservation workforce, but as a temporary rehabilitation program for unemployed youth.
So it's about fixing the kids, not fixing the forests.
Exactly. And then, in 1939, Congress did it again.
Let me guess, another temporary extension.
Yep. They passed another temporary extension through 1943, once again refusing to grant permanent status.
I am struggling to understand the political calculus here. If the public universally loved it, and the President of the United States is practically begging for it to be permanent, why did Congress insist on keeping it on this incredibly short, temporary leash?
To understand that resistance, we really have to immerse ourselves in the prevailing psychological and political mindset of the late 1930s.
Okay, set the scene for me.
Even at the absolute peak of the CCC's acclaim, the dominant view in Congress, and this was across party lines, by the way, was that the program was strictly a stopgap measure.
A Band-Aid.
Right. It was bitter medicine for a sick economy. In their view, the country ought to be optimistic enough about its future to expect that it wouldn't need a massive federally funded relief program forever.
So to make it permanent would essentially be a formal admission that high unemployment, or at least a massive class of idle young men, was just a permanent, unsolvable feature of American capitalism.
That is the core of the political anxiety right there. Granting permanence meant admitting the emergency was endless.
Wow.
But by keeping it temporary, Congress created a massive structural risk for the agency. And this is a crucial concept for understanding the life cycle of any government program.
Okay, break that down for us.
A permanent agency, one that is written into the fundamental code of the government, must be affirmatively abolished.
Right. You have to actively pass a law to kill it.
Exactly. If you want to kill a permanent agency, you have to draft a bill, debate it on the floor, hold a highly public, highly controversial up or down vote, and go on the congressional record saying, I am destroying this institution.
Which is the last thing any politician wants to do if the institution is beloved by voters.
It's political suicide.
Right. It's like the difference between someone having to actively call you into an office and fire you versus just deciding not to renew your temporary contract.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
Because if they have to fire you, there's a paper trail. There's an uncomfortable meeting. There's a chance for you to defend yourself and, potential blowback from your peers.
Right. There's friction.
But if your temporary contract just expires, The HR department just lets the clock run out. There's no drama. There's just silence. Your key card just stops working one day.
That analogy perfectly captures the danger of temporary charters. The temporary status meant the CCC was perpetually living on borrowed time.
It was always just one vote away from disappearing.
Exactly. Every few years, it had to justify its existence all over again and beg for its life. Popularity is wonderful for public relations, but a permanent charter is actual armor.
Armor against the politicians.
Yes, a permanent charter forces your enemies to fight you in the open, in broad daylight. A temporary charter allows them to just wait in the shadows until you run out of breath.
And Roosevelt's fear that this temporary status left them incredibly vulnerable proved entirely justified when a new, much larger emergency arrived to completely swallow the Great Depression.
Yes, the big shift.
Because as we move into the 1940s, the entire world is shifting, and the United States is rapidly transforming into a wartime economy.
The geopolitical landscape fundamentally changes the domestic reality for the CCC. As we move into 1940 and 1941, the U.S. begins a massive mobilization effort, well before officially entering World War II.
Right, we were gearing up.
The critical turning point documented in the sources is the Selective Training and Service Act of September 1940.
Okay, what did that act do?
This legislation establishes the first peacetime draft in United States history.
That is a seismic shift. Suddenly, the federal government is actively conscripting the exact demographic the CCC relied on to exist, which is healthy, young, able-bodied men.
Exactly, the same men.
But it wasn't just the military draft pulling men out of the camps, right? The economic environment was completely flipping.
Yeah. The industrial mobilization was just as impactful as the draft, maybe even more so. Factories across the country were rapidly spinning up to build tanks, planes, munitions, and ships for the Lend-Lease program.
Right, sending supplies to Europe?
Yeah, and these defense plants were offering real competitive wages. The CCC was, at its legal and operational core, a relief program.
It wasn't a career.
No. It offered a stipend of $1 a day, and the majority of that dollar was mandatorily sent home to the enrollee's family.
Oh, wow, so they barely kept any of it.
Right. The young man in the camp saw very little of it.
Put yourself in the shoes of a 19-year-old in 1941. For the last decade, your only option was taking that $1 a day to go dig fire trails in the woods because the local factories were boarded up.
It was survival.
But now, suddenly, you have options. You can either wait to get drafted, or you can walk into a booming defense plant and make a very comfortable living wage-building bomber engines.
The choice isn't even a choice.
No, of course you go to the factory.
The arithmetic of this economic shift is brutal, and our sources lay it out with startling clarity.
Do we have numbers?
We do. In early 1941, the CCC still maintained a massive operation, boasting roughly 300,000 enrollees.
Okay, 300,000.
Just 10 months later, by late 1941, that number plummets to 160,000.
Whoa.
The entire workforce was practically cut in half in less than a single calendar year.
How does an agency even function when half of its workforce just walks out the door? You must have half-finished bridges, half-planted forests, empty barracks.
It was chaos for the administrators.
Do our sources give us a sense of what this looked like on the ground at a local level?
Yes, we can anchor that national data with a very specific localized example from the records. Let's look at the state of Michigan.
Okay, Michigan.
In 1941, Michigan had a robust presence. 46 active CCC camps, hosting 9,400 enrollees.
That's a lot of camps.
But by mid-1942, that sprawling footprint had collapsed to just 14 camps and a mere 2,600 men.
That is a staggering contraction. Imagine being a local merchant in rural Michigan or a camp administrator watching that happen.
It would have been surreal.
You go from a bustling network of nearly 50 camps, pumping federal money and manpower into the local environment, to an absolute ghost town in a matter of months. 32 camps just vanish.
Overnight, basically.
And this creates a profound philosophical crisis for the CCC leadership, doesn't it? Their entire reason for being is disappearing.
The philosophical crisis is exactly the point. The strongest argument against the CCC in this moment wasn't an ideological attack on conservation. It was an entirely practical observation.
Which was what?
The program was specifically legally designed to convert idle young men into useful work to prevent them from starving or turning to crime. But by 1942, there were no idle young men left in America.
Right. Everyone was working or fighting.
The manpower surplus had turned into a severe manpower shortage.
It's the ultimate irony. The economic emergency that birthed the CCC had effectively cured itself. Or, well, rather, the looming war cured it.
To its critics, and even to some neutral observers. The idea of operating a massive relief agency in the middle of a severe national labor shortage looked completely absurd.
I mean, I can see their point.
The prevailing argument in Washington became incredibly simple. The emergency is over. And the devastating part for the CCC's defenders was that in a narrow economic sense, that argument was entirely true. The Depression was over.
But wait, I have to push back here.
Okay, go ahead.
I understand that the unemployment crisis was over. But if the CCC was doing all this incredible, tangible conservation work,
Right.
planting billions of trees, halting soil erosion, building infrastructure in state parks that we literally still use today, couldn't they just pivot their mission?
Pivot how?
Couldn't the leadership go to Congress and say, hey, we're no longer a relief agency for poor kids. We are now a permanent professional environmental stewardship agency? Why couldn't they just rebrand?
It is the logical question to ask from a modern perspective,
Yeah.
but it completely ignores the fundamental legislative reality of how the CCC was chartered. Its core, legally binding justification, the entire premise upon which it received its funding from Congress, was relief for the unemployed.
Oh, so it was tied legally to unemployment.
Yes. It was not chartered as an environmental agency. It was an economic relief agency that happened to do environmental work.
That is a crucial distinction.
When the mass unemployment vanished, the legal and political foundation of the agency evaporated with it. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, when the nation fully mobilized for total war, the idea of maintaining a peacetime relief program became politically indefensible.
Because of the optics.
Because of the resource allocation. You cannot justify spending federal dollars on a relief camp when the military is begging for soldiers and the factories are begging for welders.
Okay, so the war drains the camps of their manpower, and it removes the core legislative justification for the agency's existence.
Exactly.
But the war didn't just passively cause the CCC to wither away. It actually provided the perfect cover for a group of very powerful enemies who had been waiting in the wings, biding their time for almost a decade. Oh, absolutely.
Because the CCC was popular, but it wasn't universally loved by the power brokers.
The wartime turn supplied the necessary opportunity, but the knives had been out for a long time.
Let's talk about those knives.
The CCC had drawn steady, highly organized opposition from its very inception in 1933. Its massive popularity with the general public had simply held those critics at bay.
Because you can't attack what the voters love.
Right. Politicians couldn't attack it directly when their constituents loved it so much. But with the camps emptying out and the nation distracted by war, those old enemies finally saw their opening.
Our sources detail two primary groups of critics, and they make for incredibly strange bedfellows.
It's very strange.
On one side, you have organized labor, and on the other, you have fiscal conservatives. I want to start with organized labor because here's where it gets really interesting.
It's a surprising angle. I am struggling to understand this. If I'm an out-of-work union carpenter in 1938, wouldn't I want the government creating jobs? Why on earth is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, attacking a massive government-run jobs program during a depression?
It seems highly counterintuitive today, but we have to immerse ourselves in the specific context of the 1930s labor movement.
Okay, help me out here.
The AFL, led by William Green, had two very specific, very deep-seated institutional objections to the CCC. The first involved the day-to-day administration of the camps themselves.
Who was running them?
Well, while the conservation work was directed by the Departments of Agriculture and Interior, the camps themselves were actually run by the U.S. Army.
Wait, the military ran the camps. I thought these were civilian work programs. How involved was the Army?
The Army was deeply involved in the logistics. Army Reserve officers commanded the camps.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, they handled the supply chains, the transportation, the daily discipline, the mess halls, and the physical conditioning of the men.
So it felt like a boot camp.
For union leaders like William Green, observing this in the 1930s raised a terrifying specter. He publicly denounced what he called the militarization of American youth.
Ah, I see. You have to look at what was happening globally in the 1930s.
Right, look at Europe.
You have militarized youth movements sweeping across Europe, in Germany, in Italy. So Green looks at hundreds of thousands of young, working-class American men being put under direct military control in peacetime, and he sees the potential for an authoritarian labor force.
That was the ideological fear, yes. But their second objection was purely economic, and it was about self-preservation for the skilled trades.
The unions protecting their turf.
Exactly. The CCC didn't just have young men doing unskilled manual labor like digging ditches.
Uh-huh.
Over time, especially as we discussed with that 1937 education mandate, they began providing extensive vocational training.
Teaching them actual trays.
They were systematically teaching these young men heavy carpentry, masonry, heavy equipment operation, bridge building, and forestry.
So if I'm a union leader, I'm looking at this and thinking, the federal government is using taxpayer money to mass produce a generation of non-union skilled workers.
That's exactly what they saw. They saw the CCC as a factory churning out cheap competition that would eventually flood the labor market once the economy recovered.
And undercut union power.
Furthermore, they argued that having federal relief workers doing major permanent construction and forestry work at a relief wage, again, $1 a day, was artificially dragging down overall pay scales across the country.
Oh, that makes sense.
If the government can build a massive stone lodge in a state park for $1 a day per worker, why would they ever hire a union masonry crew at a prevailing wage?
The government is basically undercutting its own citizens.
Right, and the private timber industry echoed this exact sentiment from the corporate side.
The corporations agreed with the unions.
On this issue, yes, they condemned the CCC projects as government-subsidized make work that competed unfairly with private enterprise.
Okay, so that's organized labor, feeling deeply threatened by the wage suppression and the vocational training. Now, let's look at the other side of the political aisle.
The fiscal conservatives.
Right. Why were they so eager to kill it?
This was a coalition primarily made up of anti-New Deal Republicans and an increasingly vocal, powerful bloc of Southern Democrats.
Let's take the Republicans first.
For the Republicans, the objection was fundamental and philosophical. They resented the sheer cost of the program.
Because it wasn't cheap.
Maintaining hundreds of thousands of men in rural camps is incredibly expensive. They viewed the open-ended financial commitment of a permanent relief workforce as the ultimate symbol of government overreach and executive bloat.
That sounds like a standard fiscal conservative argument. But the Southern Democrats had their own specific regional grievances, didn't they? They weren't just worried about the federal budget.
No, the Southern Democratic opposition was rooted deeply in the regional economy and, frankly, the racial hierarchy of the Jim Crow South.
How did the CCC disrupt that?
Many Southern members of Congress were deeply uneasy about federal wage standards encroaching on their local economies. If the federal government is paying $1 a day, it establishes a wage floor that local agricultural interests suddenly have to compete with.
So local farmers couldn't pay pennies anymore if the government was offering $1.
Exactly. And there was a racial component to this as well, based on the demographics of the camps.
What was the demographic breakdown?
The CCC was segregated by race, adhering to the discriminatory practices of the era, but it did include a substantial number of black enrollees.
And the Southern politicians didn't like that.
In the Jim Crow South, federal intervention that provided steady wages, vocational training, and organized camp structures to black citizens was viewed by local politicians and landowners as a direct, intolerable threat to the established local racial and economic hierarchy.
They felt they were losing control.
They did not want federal money elevating the economic status of black laborers in their districts.
So we have this incredible convergence of distinct, seemingly incompatible groups.
Very incompatible.
You have union leaders terrified of wage suppression and military control. You have Republicans ideologically opposed to massive government spending. And you have Southern Democrats fiercely protecting their local racial and labor systems from federal interference.
Now, if we evaluate this impartially, strictly following the historical records, we see that none of these groups possessed the political capital to kill the program on their own during peacetime.
Because the public loved it too much.
The CCC was simply too popular with the voters. Any politician who stood up in 1938 and said, "I want to abolish the CCC," would have been voted out of office.
So they had to bide their time.
But the war changed the calculus entirely. The onset of World War II gave all of these disparate groups a shared, politically unassailable justification to strike.
Because suddenly they didn't have to argue their specific, more controversial points anymore.
Yep.
William Greene didn't have to argue about union wages, and Southern Democrats didn't have to argue about local hierarchies.
They could simply unite under the patriotic banner of wartime efficiency.
Wrap it in the flag.
They could march onto the floor of Congress and argue that maintaining the CCC was now a waste and extravagance when every single ounce of national manpower, steel, and funding was desperately needed to fight the Axis powers.
Which brings us to the most fascinating and frankly Machiavellian part of this entire deep dive. How did this strange coalition of enemies actually pull the plug?
The mechanics are incredible.
How do you dismantle a massive institution that the public still largely remembers fondly without facing the wrath of the voters? Because the mechanics of how they executed this is, well, it's a masterclass in bureaucratic assassination.
It requires looking very closely at the timeline and the precise legal mechanism they employed for the final blow.
Right.
We really have to walk through the spring and summer of 1942, month by month, to see how the trap was sprung.
Let's do it. So in May 1942, we start to see the public mood shifting.
The polling starts to turn.
Right. It's not a total repudiation of the CCC, but the wartime reality is sinking in. Polling reported via the Detroit Free Press at the time shows that about 51% of the public now favors the abolition of the Corps.
A slim majority, but a majority.
The war effort is completely all-consuming. Every family has a son or a brother in uniform or working in a defense plant, and people are legitimately starting to question why we still have young men sitting in peacetime relief camps planting trees.
Recognizing this sudden, massive vulnerability in public opinion, President Roosevelt makes a final, desperate plea to save the agency he created.
He tries one last time.
He does. He doesn't ask for the permanent 300,000-man agency he wanted in 1937. He knows that dream is dead.
So what does he ask for?
He asks Congress for a mere $50 million.
Just $50 million.
He wants to keep a skeleton crew, roughly 150 camps out of the thousands that once existed, open.
What would those 150 camps even do?
Primarily essential conservation work, maintaining the infrastructure they already built, and providing vital forest fire protection, particularly on the West Coast, where there were real fears of incendiary attacks from the Japanese.
It's an incredibly modest request. Just $50 million to keep the lights on, to preserve the institutional knowledge, to keep the agency alive on life support until the war is over.
But Congress wasn't having it.
Right. On June 5, 1942, the House of Representatives takes up this appropriation measure, and this is where Representative Albert J. Engel, a Republican from Michigan, steps up to lead the abolition forces on the floor.
His speech is fascinating.
I want to look closely at his strategy here because he doesn't come out swinging an axe at the legacy of the CCC. He's very clever.
Representative Engel's rhetoric is brilliant in its framing. He knows he cannot insult the memory of the program.
Because it's still popular.
So, he concedes the point. He states on the congressional record that the program has done, quote, a great deal of good.
He praises it.
He openly acknowledges its past successes and the value it brought to the country during the Depression. But then he executes a flawless pivot.
The bait and switch.
He points to what he characterizes as a great deal of waste and extravagance in trying to maintain a relief apparatus during a total war.
He frames it as a wartime issue.
He argues that it is simply no longer necessary and that funding it detracts from the war effort. And with that argument, the House defeats the $50 million appropriation.
So the House says no. They refuse to fund the skeleton crew, but the legislative process isn't over?
Right, there's always the Senate.
The bill goes to a House-Senate Conference Committee to iron out the differences. And in June and July of 1942, they finally passed the Labor Federal Security Appropriation Act for 1943.
And this is the fatal blow.
They do approve some money for the CCC. They allocate roughly $8 million. But there's a massive fatal catch to this money.
And this is where we zero in on the exact legal mechanism that we promised to uncover at the start of this deep dive.
Yes, explain this part clearly.
And $8 million was strictly legally earmarked for one specific purpose: to liquidate the agency.
Just to shut it down.
It was not operational funding. Congress didn't draft a standalone bill that said the Civilian Conservation Corps is hereby abolished forever.
It never held that up or down vote.
Exactly. They didn't hold a grand, dramatic vote to terminate its existence. They just refused to fund its operations and instead gave it a severance package.
A severance package.
They gave it just enough money to hire the lawyers and accountants needed to shut it down.
It's astounding. I'm thinking back to the analogy of a plant. It's exactly like deciding you want a house plant dead, but instead of chopping it down with an axe where everyone can see you doing it, you just stop watering it.
It's the exact same result.
The end result is exactly the same. The plant dies, the agency disappears, but no one catches you holding the axe. You have total plausible deniability.
That is the immense political utility of defunding as a legislative weapon. It is characterized by procedural quietness.
Right.
No politician had to go home to their district, stand in front of a crowd of voters who loved the CCC, and go on the record saying, I voted to destroy the Civilian Conservation Corps.
If confronted, what did they say?
They can simply say, I voted for a responsible wartime budget, or I merely allowed an appropriation bill to lapse because we needed those funds for bombers.
It provides the perfect political shield. So, operations formally ceased on June 30th, 1942. Just like that, the funding vanished, the legal authority lapsed, and the agency was dead.
He was gone.
But I am still trying to wrap my head around the logistics of this. You have a 200,000-man operation spread across thousands of camps in every state in the Union.
It's a massive footprint.
You don't just lock the doors, throw the keys in the dirt, and walk away.
No.
How does an operation of that magnitude actually go out of business overnight? Where do all those people and all that stuff actually go?
The sources detail an incredibly orderly, highly structured liquidation process, which was meticulously carried out and completed by mid-1943.
Who was doing the liquidating?
You have to remember, thanks in part to that Army administration that the labor unions hated so much, this was a highly disciplined organization.
Oh, right, the military influence.
Even in its death throes, the CCC maintained strict bureaucratic discipline. About 1,800 appointed employees, the career administrators who ran the agency, were tasked with organizing their own unemployment.
Wow. Working yourself out of a job.
They were carefully separated from service over the course of a year.
And then there is the matter of the property. The physical inventory of this agency must have been mind-boggling.
It was immense.
We're talking about the physical plan of a massive national construction and forestry operation. Thousands of barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, heavy machinery like bulldozers, tractors, and graders.
Millions of tools.
Literally millions of hand tools, shovels, axes, saws, thousands of transport vehicles. All of that had to be accounted for and relocated.
It was one of the largest transfers of civilian governmental assets in history. The vast majority of the CCC's equipment and facilities were handed directly over to the War and Navy departments.
So it fed the war machine.
The infrastructure was immediately repurposed. The rural CCC barracks were converted into military training facilities, or, later in the war, into prisoner of war camps.
Oh, interesting.
The fleet of trucks, the bulldozers, the heavy engineering equipment, all of it was painted olive drab and sent directly to military engineers and Seabees preparing for overseas deployment.
Which brings us to the final ledger of this deep dive. When the dust settled in 1943 and the last administrator turned out the lights, what actually died and what survived?
Let's start with what died.
What died?
What died was the specific model itself. The ideological concept of the federal government acting as the employer of last resort for idle youth, specifically harnessed to the physical improvement of public lands.
The standing federal conservation workforce.
That concept, the idea of a standing federal workforce ready to absorb the unemployed, was extinguished.
But what survived is almost hard to comprehend. When you look at the physical legacy left behind by this agency that only existed for 9 years, it's staggering.
The numbers are incredible.
We're talking about 3 billion trees planted. Roughly 1,500 state parks were either created entirely from scratch, and I think about 700 of those were brand new, or vastly improved with new infrastructure.
They transformed the country.
They strung tens of thousands of miles of fire roads and trails through impassable wilderness. They built thousands of fire lookout towers that protected millions of acres of timber.
If you have ever taken a family vacation and enjoyed the intricate stonework, the lodges, or the winding trails at the Grand Canyon, Grand Teton, or Yellowstone National Parks, you are interacting with the physical legacy of the CCC.
It's everywhere.
If you have ever walked the preserved battlefields at Shiloh and Gettysburg, you are walking on ground maintained and restored by these men. The infrastructure of the American outdoors was largely built in a 9-year window by a temporary agency.
And beyond the physical footprint, there is the human legacy.
This is perhaps the most profound and lasting impact of the program.
How so?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of American history, the CCC wasn't just destroyed by the war, it was completely absorbed by it.
Right.
Over the course of its existence, 3 million young men passed through those camps. They arrived often malnourished and demoralized.
Kids of the Depression.
In the camps, they learned strict discipline, they achieved peak physical conditioning, and they developed the habit of organized collective work under a chain of command.
So when the camps closed and the draft notices went out, those 3 million men took those exact skills directly into the armed forces and the booming war economy.
Exactly. The relief to readiness pipeline of the CCC dissolved seamlessly into the American war machine. The young man who learned to drive a heavy truck building a fire road in a Montana forest in 1938 was the exact same man driving a supply truck across France in 1944.
That's a powerful image.
The man who learned to build a suspension bridge in a state park was building pontoon bridges across the Rhine. The CCC had inadvertently prepared an entire generation of American youth for the physical and logistical demands of global war.
So we look at this ledger, the breathtaking parks, the restored forests, the millions of men who went on to literally win World War. The CCC was undeniably, spectacularly successful in its mission to shape citizens and build lasting public goods.
Without a doubt.
It achieved everything it set out to do, and the public loved it for it. Yet that very success, combined with its immense popularity, was completely useless when it came to saving the agency itself.
It's the central paradox of this entire historical deep dive. Popularity is not a strategy for institutional survival.
It's not enough.
Popularity is a byproduct of success, yes, but it does not protect you when the political winds shift, when the budget gets tight, or when the underlying legislative justification for your existence suddenly changes.
Wow.
Popularity without a permanent legal charter is just a sandcastle waiting for the tide.
And that brings us to the profound lesson for today. I want to speak directly to you listening to this right now. We are living in an era where people are constantly floating the idea of a new CCC.
You see it in the news all the time.
You hear constantly proposals for a modern climate corps, a new national conservation workforce to tackle green energy or infrastructure.
It's a very popular idea.
If there is ever going to be a modern equivalent to the CCC, the architects of that new agency absolutely must study and internalize the harsh, quiet lessons of 1937 and 1942.
They had to get the structure right.
If you want to build a new corps that lasts, you cannot rely on good vibes, high polling numbers, or even visible success. It must be built with a permanent charter from day one.
No temporary extensions.
It must be designed so deeply into the permanent federal framework that it can only be abolished on purpose, in the open, on the floor of Congress, rather than quietly allowed to lapse in a backroom budget committee via defunding.
Because otherwise it's just a matter of time.
Because the history is clear. If you build a temporary thing, no matter how much the public loves it, no matter how much good it does, you are building something that is structurally designed to die.
The history provides a very sobering blueprint. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as we conclude our analysis of these sources.
What's that?
We rightly remember the CCC for the magnificent parks it built and the billions of trees it planted. But consider for a moment those 1,800 final appointed employees and camp administrators in 1942.
The ones who shut it down.
They spent the last year of their tenure carefully, methodically organizing their own obsolescence. They knew they were out of a job.
Yeah.
Yet they dutifully packed up the barracks, perfectly inventoried the millions of tools, and shipped the equipment to the Navy to help win the war.
That takes a lot of professionalism.
It does. When an institution acts with that much discipline, that much quiet dignity right up to its dying breath, do we simply mourn the loss of the agency? Or do we celebrate the fact that it worked exactly as it was supposed to, serving the country flawlessly until the very last day?
That is a phenomenal question to leave off on, and it completely reframes how we look at the lifespan of government programs. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll catch you next time.